There are two things you can say that will guarantee that the archer will tremble. The first is fire an arrow. The second is the archer's paradox. A lot of commentators make use of the phrase archer's paradox way too liberally. You hear things like you have to compensate for the archer's paradox, or there's less paradox with this bow, or the archer's paradox will affect the power of the arrow, and so on. Just to be clear, the flexing of the arrow is not the archer's paradox. Now, the reason why this misconception of the paradox is so widely spread is partly because of videos on YouTube. And I think many of you who watch archery videos may have come across certain informational videos which talk about the archer's paradox. And you'll see slow motion footage of an archer releasing an arrow, and it leaves the bow and flexes around it very majestically. And people associate, well, the videos about archer's paradox, you'll see this arrow flexing, that's the archer's paradox. And well, no, it's not. That is not the archer's paradox. The flexing of the arrow is the effect of the archer's paradox, but it isn't the paradox itself. First, you have to remember what the word paradox actually means. A paradox is when something is seemingly counterintuitive. Something is the opposite of what you should expect it to be. That's the paradox. An arrow flexing isn't paradoxical. To debunk this misconception, let's visualize what the paradox actually looks like. So let's say I want to hit the right target. So here's my arrow, and in theory, all I need to do is to point the arrow straight at the target and make it go forward, and therefore, boop, that would be a bullseye. Next, I need my tool, and that's of course the bow. Now, intuitively, all I have to do is to point my bow at the target, and it should shoot straight. So when you pull it back, the string goes back, you let it go, it goes straight back forward. That's how a bow works, right? Pull it back, let it go, string goes forward, arrow goes forward. So as long as I keep this string perfectly aligned with the center of target and it moves forward, I'll shoot the middle, right? So we'll keep the bow there, and now we'll place the arrow. Apparently I can't get the arrow to go through the middle of the bow handle. So I've knocked the arrow, so maybe this will work out. We'll put the string right in the middle of the target so it goes forward, but oh, hang on. The arrow is pointing off to the side. Now, if the arrow goes in a straight line, it's off target. The string goes forward, but the arrow goes sideways. Unfortunately, I can't pull the string through the camera, so I can't demonstrate the last part very well, but let's imagine this. So I've got the bow lined up, and the string is lined up, and the arrow is pointing off target. So that's the full draw, roughly, and the point of the arrow is actually no longer off target. So at brace, I'll keep the string lined up the middle. And now full draw. So again, while I can't perfectly show this, that's a general idea of the archer's paradox. It's a bit of a misperception. So it looks like the arrow is pointing away from the target, but at full draw, again with the string drawn back, which I can't do, it actually looks like the arrow has lessened its angle of deflection. And this difference between the arrow's line at full draw versus at brace is part of what makes the paradox confusing. Perhaps it might be easier to see the paradox from this point of view. Now I'm going to aim at the camera. I do apologize if it freaks you out. There's nobody here, it's okay. But this is the idea. So I want to have this string lined up with the center of the camera lens, and to get the arrow on the bow, it points to the side. Okay, so we can't shoot straight through the middle of the bow. When I come to full draw, and therefore bring the arrow closer online, the arrow actually points at the camera. Now, not directly at the camera lens, but considering from here, I'm actually pointing way off to the side. At full draw, the point of the arrow is nearly straight in line with the lens. I'm not moving across to do this, but I'm keeping the bow as still as possible. Pull it back. There comes the line. So as we saw before, the arrow starts in position where it points away from the target, but at full draw, it points towards the target. That's the paradox. The paradox is, well, that shouldn't happen. The arrow should, in fact, continue to point away from the target even though I'm at full draw, but it doesn't. Most of the visual aids you see depict this from above, so you can more easily see that angle, but that's the general idea. It points one way at brace, and at full draw, it points another way. That's basically it. That's all the Archer's paradox is. It's this visual deception where it should point one way when at brace, but at full draw, it actually points straight towards target. So when people mention that the Archer's paradox causes a loss of power, or it makes a shot more inaccurate, or you have to compensate for the Archer's paradox, or certain bows or types make it easy to shoot with Archer's paradox, it doesn't make any sense. Because the paradox is simply that starting point, that's end point. Start point, end point. Has no effect on power and accuracy. So you then might ask, well, what about the flex? All these people and channels are flexing the arrow and saying that's the Archer's paradox. Like I said before, the flex of the arrow is the result of the Archer's paradox. So as we said, the arrow is deflecting away from the center of the bow. Remember, when you release the string doesn't follow the arrow. It goes straight back towards the bow. That's the plane of the bow. So when the string and bow are lined up, you pull it back, string goes back forward, that's the center line of the bow. The arrow, however, is pointing the other way. So by pulling it back and letting it go, the arrow has to get around the bow to follow the line which the string was going towards. And that's what causes the arrow to flex. It must get around the bow because the direction of the force, or the plane of the bow, is pointing in one direction while the arrow at full draw is slightly off. That flexing of the arrow to get around the bow is what you see in the slow motion videos. Now I want to clarify that the arrow isn't moving side to side. It's moving in a straight line and the arrow is oscillating in flight. And the main function of the fletching is to stabilize that flight so that it doesn't go off too far one way or the other. It does allow the arrow to stay within a particular sweet spot. And the reason why spine rating is so important in the context of Archer's paradox is that the shaft needs to be flexible enough to clear the bow on release. Again, the arrow must get around the bow. If it's not soft enough, it will hit the bow on the way out. Too soft, and it might still hit the bow on the way out, therefore causing clearance problems and affecting the accuracy of the bow. So again, the flex of the arrow is the effect of the Archer's paradox, the apparent deflection of the arrow, not the cause of the Archer's paradox, or it isn't the paradox itself. There's one more thing I want to point out, and this again has to do with what causes this misconception over what the Archer's paradox is. Remember how I said that you couldn't shoot through the middle of the bow, which is why the arrow has to go around the bow? Well, most modern bows are designed to be shot through the middle. So most bows designed today have a center shot. Basically, the riser, which is the handle of the bow, is cut to the point where you have this window in the bow, which means that you can now align the string with the target position the arrow on the bow so that it points straight at the target. And in this case, for the center shot bows, or bows cut past center shot, there are some which aren't quite past center shot. The point is, the archer's paradox here is basically either non-existent or it's minimalized. So with this center shot, I can align the center of the bow with the target, pull the string straight back, and the arrow will also go straight back. There's no deflection and there's no flexing around the bow. The flex will still happen because with the way we release the strings with our fingers, there will be a natural sideways motion as we release, as we uncurl our fingers. So there still will be a flex in the arrow, but it isn't caused from the archer's paradox, which again is mitigated with modern bow designs which have a center shot capacity. Let's remember, you still have to clear the bow. There is contact with the riser, but you don't need such a large amount of flex to achieve that. So that's the best I can do to clarify this misconception about the archer's paradox. Again, most people seem to think that the flexing is the paradox. That is not the archer's paradox, nor is it paradoxical in any way. The archer's paradox is quite simply, it's pointing one way, and then when you draw it back, it points the other. The flexing of the arrow happens because of this apparent deflection, so when the arrow is pushed forward by the string, it must correct its flight to stay on course. The archer's paradox isn't really a problem. It doesn't have to be compensated for, not in the way you think it does. The arrow does fly straight, so as long as you point the arrow in the right direction, it will go there. The thing which an archer must consider is the choice of spine, which, if it's not matched correctly, will result in the arrow drifting one way or the other, because there's too much compensation or there's too little. It's a spine choice, not a technique or an aim point. That's why historically arrows had to be a certain material, certain thickness, certain length to have that clearance. Other historical styles might use things like hatra, which moves the bow away from the arrow to help improve clearance as well, among other things. A big thing to note is that if you're used to using a modern bow and you haven't used a traditional bow without a center shot cutout, then you're not perceiving the archer's paradox. And that's again because the arrow is on target to begin with and it doesn't change its angle much, if at all. Anyway, I hope that does something to clear it up. It does get a little messy when talking about semantics and definitions and terminology. But again, it's not that big a deal, but just understand that this isn't a paradox. And when you say archer's paradox, a lot of people will not understand that you mean this. Anyway, this is NUSensei. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.